Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today, Inclusive Metadata and Conscious Editing for Digital Collections and Archives, leading inclusively towards more equitable and discoverable records. My name is Keila Ruiz, and I am the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator at Florida State University, and my role there is to coordinate the daily activities of the Sunshine State Digital Network and conduct outreach, and I help connect Florida's cultural heritage institutions to share their digital collections to the Digital Public Library of America.
And I'm Kelley Rowan. I'm the Digital Archives Librarian in the Digital Collections Center at FIU. And besides my usual work, publishing our university theses and dissertations and helping manage our digital repository, I am also currently helping spearhead our conscious metadata movement.
Hi, and I'm Jamie Rogers. I'm the Assistant Director of Digital Collections at Florida International University. And in addition to my role here at the university, I also participate in the implementation team of the Sunshine State Digital Network, and I am the chair of the training working group. So in both instances, helping to lead us forward at our university and statewide in inclusive metadata practices.
So to get us started, let's define what inclusive metadata and conscious editing are. So as you can see here, inclusive metadata is more of a theory around promoting respectful representation in our collections descriptions. And then conscious editing is putting that theory into practice by implementing workflows and actually editing and remediating metadata records using the inclusive metadata practices. So one of the first things that you might think about doing when implementing these practices in your collections is thinking about adding a harmful language or content statement to your collections or your website. So these statements help provide context to our users about your efforts to remediate metadata. They also inform users about professional practices and why they might encounter harmful content or language when they're looking through your collections. So it's important in providing context for our users to have these. So this is an example here of a harmful content statement. In this example, it explains why the types of materials you see in a collection are collected, preserved, and presented online. And it also refers specifically to the content and language of the materials themselves rather than to the descriptions of those materials. So the content itself rather than the language used to describe that content. And that's where a harmful language statement comes in. So this statement here addresses the goal of the library to provide respectful representation in their collections. It also explains the practices that led to potentially offensive or harmful descriptions showing up in the item or collection descriptions. And then it provides information about ongoing efforts at that library to update and remediate problematic descriptions. So they serve different purposes and they help provide useful context in those two situations. So when thinking about adding a statement like this to your collections or to your items, you can think about combining them so that they're in one place for users to find and provide the full context of your efforts and the practices. Let lead to the collection and presentation of these resources. And you could decide to put this in different places on your repository. So you could add a statement to a page, like an about page or a facts page, a more information page in your repository that users can refer to. You can also add this a statement to individual records depending on the content and context of those records. or you can add it to various collections pages. So if a particular collection might have more problematic content or harmful content in it, you could add it to like a collection level page where users will find it when they are introduced to the collection. Or you can link it on a search results page. So have a link at the bottom or the top of the search results that lead users to your harmful language or content statement that they can refer to from the search results. And another important thing to consider when writing your statement is to provide a method for users to provide feedback. So either a form or an email that a user can use when they encounter offensive or harmful content, so that your library can address the issues that the users encounter, either by responding to that user about why you may or may not be changing that language, and also to have some sort of tracking method on your end when people identify problematic content or records. And here there is some example text for how you can address a feedback method for your users. So also when thinking about conscious editing, you want to think about how you're going to approach the analysis of your collections and your descriptions. So you want to work to identify and prioritize your collections that likely have content or language that may be harmful or offensive. So this doesn't necessarily happen all in the metadata, right? So there might be items in your collections that are images that don't necessarily have robust description or don't necessarily address potentially harmful content within the image, that you might need to do some manual searching, or you're familiar enough with your collections to be able to identify places where that is more likely. So creating that list and identifying that, and then developing a priority list around those collections and those records. And then you want to also develop a list of terms that you can search by, that you think will likely reside in your description or that may potentially reside in your description. There are different ways that you can go about approaching this, obviously depending on what the content in your collections are, but thinking about those categories of misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, racism, sexism, thinking about broadly about those categories and what terms might reside there. So developing this list that you can search by is going to be another starting point. And then once you have that, identifying useful thesauri for that content so that you can then replace those harmful terms with more appropriate, more modern, and less offensive terms that we use in our vernacular today. So a good example of an alternative thesauri for homophobic content is the Homosaurus, which provides language around LGBTQ content. So thinking about where you can find alternative language is going to be the next step after identifying potentially problematic terms in your collections. And then you want to think about how to incorporate this work in your legacy collections. So all of the existing description that you already have, and then how to incorporate that into policies going forward. So thinking about how to add context to collections as you're processing them, and when you're digitizing them, what is appropriate context, and how to incorporate that when you're prioritizing new things for digitization and processing. So those are going to be different workflows for obvious reasons. One is retroactive, and the other is moving forward. So the processes are going to be slightly different, but you want to think about how you're going to do that both in both contexts. And then you also want to think about how this this work isn't necessarily done in a silo. So very often processing or prioritizing for digital collections or description is most often done in one department, and uh, often those decisions are made within that department alone. But you want to think about when to consult other experts or members of your community um, as appropriate when looking at the content and context of the materials that you're examining. So don't try to do this all on your own. You definitely want to seek help and appropriate expertise around these areas, as we're not experts in all of the potentially problematic issues in our collections and ways to solve that. So think about this as collaborative, and don't try to do this in a silo. And then you want to think about distinguishing content and standards. So very often when we're working with published and monographic material, we are going to have more limitations in our bibliographic catalogs. So like when we're working with MARC and with many ILS systems, there will be more limitations regarding which vocabularies you can use and how you can address notes or content and language statements in those systems. So be mindful of that, but think about ways that you can be flexible in that system and try to implement that as best as you can. When it comes to archival description, it is a little bit more flexible than bibliographic metadata in our ILS catalogs. So, but it also is just more broad description, right? So you're describing a collection rather than, or something at a folder level and not item by item. DAX offers a middle ground by having archival authorities, but also allowing a lot of local flexibility due to the very nature of archival collections. So there's a lot more wiggle room there when it comes to describing the collections at your institution. So this flexibility will allow for more adaptability to conscious and inclusive metadata practices. And then when we look at individual items in our digitized collections, is even more flexible because we're not limited to describing things in a broad sense. We're able to actually look at that item and add appropriate context or add content warnings and things like that to those individual items where that isn't applicable necessarily in our archival description. There's also more flexibility in Dublin Core and mods in thinking about where information goes and how you apply that information, and with labeling. So very often our digital collection systems will give us more flexibility with that, and we can implement broader standards around linked data, which offer a lot of alternative vocabularies that we can use so that our work is still consistent and applies to standards, but has that flexibility and malleability that comes with linked data and the expansion of where we get our vocabularies. So I wanted to stick this quote in here so that we remember that this work is iterative. This is not something that is one and done. It's something that's going to continue to be part of our processes moving forward. And, you know, being responsive to users and to changes in language, knowledge, and context. So it may seem daunting, but it is just something that is going to be incorporated in our work and is going to be continually changing, but is important to incorporate in our workflows. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Kelley Rowan, and she can tell us a little bit more about how they've approached this and started doing this work at Florida International University.
Great, thank you, Keila. I don't know if I have control of the slides. There we go. All right, thank you. So like Keila said, I'm going to tell you about how we started going about this. And I have a link to our digital repository up here, dpanther. And I figured when I first started this that I would just put in some of these harmful or pejorative terms and just see what was in our collections. And that led me to think, well, let's start writing this down. And so I developed a spreadsheet as I went through various terms. And I kept a count also. So I have a column for the actual term, a column for the number of records where it comes up. And then I have two more columns. I have one more that tells you what the fix is for this term, the preferred terminology, but then also a notes column, because some of this isn't just terms. Some of these are more like historical context. So couple examples, one that I like to use is when you come across the word riot, right? Okay, so there's nothing like technically wrong with that word, correct? So it's not an offensive word, but we need to look at what happened in that riot and question, is it a riot or is it a rebellion or is it a massacre? And so we just saw, some of that terminology changed by Library of Congress. So we need to look also at that historical context. So as our spreadsheet grew, we broke it down into tabs where we had things like religion, the various ethnicities. We had our largest one, I believe, like the one that got the most hits was just the word woman. And the reason that's in there, because again, there's nothing wrong with the word woman, but we're looking for, they're unidentified. Most of the women are unidentified because why name a woman? So we want to go back and fix things like that too. We also have a great list in the spreadsheet of terms like aggrandizing type terms, like notable, great, things like this, so that you can go back and look at those. So for instance, you might have a record related to Thomas Jefferson, and it might say esteemed or whatever terminology they're using. But it's good to look at these. It's generally white men that get these terms. And like, did they include everything about, if you're going to include half of his history, are you going to include all of it? Like, is slaveholder listed? So we're looking at things like that too. So it's a pretty full spreadsheet at this point. We developed a second document, which was where we could just throw in useful things we found. One place that I found was good to turn to were museums. They had some of them, for instance, I think it used to be called the Native American Museum, something like the Smithsonian one. Now it's the Museum of the American Indian, I think that's how they phrased it, but American Indian is the phrasing they're using. So sometimes that can help you figure out too what the appropriate word is. So our resource page right now, which we're working on turning it into a LibGuide, is full of various thesauri. Keila mentioned the homosaurus. There's ones for disability. There's a bunch of them. And then articles that relate to these. All right. So step 2 for us has been to hold an overview meeting. We actually invited all of our departments. At this time, we don't have enough done, I think, for us to be really to have anything to offer to our reference department. So we're going to try to engage them when we have a little more done. But at this point, we have already met with special collections. We've met with sound and imaging and cataloging, and then GRID is our government resources. So we're hoping to get a meeting with them very soon. And but we had an overview meeting. That was the first step, where we invited everybody and just told them what was going on and asked them, how can we help you? What would you like to see from us? And so then we broke it down into departmental meetings. And so I put a couple things here that just popped up that it was very interesting as we moved to departmental meetings to find out what the departments were most, most passionate about changing. For sound and image, they're dealing with a huge Diaz Ayala collection of Cuban music. And so being able to spell somebody's name correctly with the diacritics. This was a big one for them, feeling that, you know, obviously, if you can't spell somebody's name right, that's also disrespectful. And I think for special collections, like it's just such a massive amount of photos they have, and trying to identify all these people, you know, was a major concern for them. So it was really great to break it down into departmental meetings and see what the biggest concerns were for the different departments. And so, you know, we asked in these meetings, we asked every department, like, what needs to be assessed? What do you feel needs to be looked at, maybe remediated? We already knew, of course, on our end, as part of digital collections, that we're going to be looking at our institutional repository and our digital repository, but also finding aids. I think special collections, talking about their finding aids, the catalog. So all these things are going to need to be assessed. Let's move to our next slide. Oh, I think I missed a slide in there. Keila, can you move? Oops. All right, I'm going to hand control back to Keila because there's a bit of a lag when I do it. And Keila, can you? There's the one I'm looking for. Thank you. All right. So from our meetings, this is what we've developed so far. There are some staff considerations. So this is something you might want to think about as you dive into this too. So some departments are considering whether, as they try to look at this metadata, if they're just going to have to deal with the metadata like being created now because they don't have the time and the staff to go back and do remediation right now, or if they can find a way to do both. So that's, you know, I think all libraries struggle with feeling like they have enough staff. So that's something that's definitely going to be a consideration for a lot of us probably. We decided to create a listserv. So for those of us that are working on this, where we can have conversations and kind of group discuss, like developing a harmful language statement, things like that. Everyone in our departmental meetings has expressed interest thus far in having regular monthly meetings. So that is something we plan to start as well. And as I said, we're working on our first task is to kind of develop a general harmful language statement that just kind of covers all the collections. And then the departments can work on deciding whether they need item level, collection level on certain collections that they have. A decision tree was brought up by someone, which we thought was great, for images, like, you know, if you have this, do this, you know, the decision tree is. So that'll probably be another task we'll start soon. And then just developing our own like local thesaurus for our collections. There's a lot of collections, you know, we don't have that other people have, that there's no reason for us to try and kind of develop the language for, because we don't hold the collections that would relate to. So we'll develop our own specific one for our collections. And that's where we are so far. So we're just getting things started and we're just about to really dive into doing the actual work. And now I'm going to hand it back to Keila, who will tell you what they are doing at FSU.
Thank you, Kelley. You guys are very busy at work. You are further along than we are at Florida State University. So we're currently in our planning stage of our process. We haven't developed any lists or priorities yet, but we're determining our scope for our project. So we are initially going to focus on finding aids and digital library content, and we're holding off on the catalog for right now. We've outlined some deliverables, and we're developing a priority list, or developing our priorities in terms of our deliverables. So we have formed a group that have representatives from different departments in the library that include our cataloging department, our special collections and archives unit, and our digital scholarship unit, because our digital library and our institutional repository, while they share the same system, are run out of 2 different departments. So we've involved both of those departments in that group that we have formed. And then we're currently identifying training and literature so that we can ensure that everyone is on the same page around their understanding of their current practices in this area. And we're developing our project plan. So where to get started. So some of the deliverables that we've identified over the next 18 months include posting a harmful language statement, a harmful content and language statement on our repository pages so that people understand that we are starting work on this and providing a feedback mechanism for users to report issues. We feel like this reporting mechanism is going to help us to identify potentially problematic terms and also potentially problematic content that might not have things in the metadata. And it's also a way for us to involve our reference services as well, since they are the ones that are very often helping users do research in these systems. So currently, we have limited hours and we're not open to the public. We're just open to our students and faculty. So the people who are working on virtual reference are being way more hands-on right now in terms of going into the collections and helping users do their research. So we feel like having that feedback mechanism in place as soon as possible will help us involve them and identifying any problematic areas and contribute to our priorities list. We also hope to have developed a best practice and workflow documentation after having done a very small pilot project. So we're going to take a look at these lists and pick a project that we feel is manageable and will help inform, has a variety of content that will help inform our process going forward with other collections. And then we're going to develop our priority list going from there and use that documentation. Obviously, that documentation will not be set in stone. It is going to have some flexibility built into it, and it'll get refined as we do more and more work in that area. And then we're going to have a timeline established for additional remediation projects going forward. And then in terms of prioritizing for new collections that are going into our digital spaces, having something in place for us to have considerations in there around description and selection. And then we're going to be developing a framework to expand this work into the library catalog. So one of the reasons that we're not involving the library catalog in our initial phase of our process is because all of the public universities and colleges are currently in the process of migrating our ILS system to a different system. And that is taking a lot of effort and energy right now from our cataloging department. So we instead are going to be developing a framework that can be expanded into the catalog around special collections materials specifically, but then that they can take that and potentially apply it more broadly to other materials in our collections. So that's where we're starting. We're very much in the infancy of our project, and we have a lot to consider still, and a lot of conversations to be had still. So we are planning to have a lot of conversations, and producing documentation is really going to be our focus initially moving forward. So as I said, there's going to be a lot of considerations going into that. And Jamie is going to talk to us a little bit more about some of those considerations that you might want to think about when starting your project.
Thank you so much, Keila and Kelley, for sharing what this implementation has looked like so far at both FIU and FSU. And as Keila mentioned, I'm going to be sharing some of the possible considerations and kind of opportunities that come up with these type of initiatives. And I want to say that this is not comprehensive, and you might come up with additional considerations and other opportunities as you go through this process. But these are things that we have discovered and questions that have come up while we have been doing this work. So one of the first considerations when you're thinking about developing a harmful language statement is, where do you place this type of statement? Is this something that you're going to include at the repository level? Is it the collection level? Is it something that you're including in each record? There are pros and cons to each of these approaches. For instance, if you're thinking about including a statement at a repository or collection level, that means that if you participate in different aggregation systems, for instance, in the Digital Public Library of America, or if you have collections harvested into your ILS system, you may lose that context and you might not have it readily available for folks that are discovering your records through those avenues. Also, if you do include harmful language statements at the record level, you may impact your searchability of those records, because a lot of times the language that you include in these types of statements are going to be searchable. And some of this is going to be impacted by your specific systems that you have in place, and the ability to either make text not searchable, etc. So it's all something to kind of think about, to consider your audience, and to consider where they're going to be accessing your collection materials from. So another consideration is, when and where do you make the changes to the record? So for instance, you've gone and made additions to your collection regarding harmful language, stating where you are in the process of making changes for more equitable descriptive practices. However, you are starting to actually put this into practice. So when you are making this determination, it's important to consider the format of your content. When you are dealing with books or song titles or things like that that are not archivist created, that might be an instance where you add additional description to a record that gives some context, rather than making changes to the actual metadata. And this may seem fairly obvious, and I'm sure it is, but this is all something to keep in mind when you're laying out your policies and best practices for your collections. Also, something to consider are system limitations. You may want to hide specific thumbnails that may have potentially harmful imagery, or you might want to have pop-up warnings and things like that. And you might be limited by what's in place with the system you have for your either digital asset management system, your catalog, or your finding aid. But it's important to kind of bring this all together and work it into your internal guidelines for how you'll handle specific situations. And sometimes we've talked about creating decision trees for certain solutions, so that it kind of walks you through the process, because at times it may be difficult for an individual archivist to make this determination without having some kind of guidelines in place about how to make a decision. So things like developing decision trees may be useful in your institution. And then finally, this ties into where we mentioned you might want to add harmful language statements. You also, for where you make changes to the record, want to be mindful of where these records will be visible. Are they going to be visible only internally within your collection that have very specific context already built in? Or is this something that's going to be more distributed and accessed without this additional context? And this will probably guide your decisions in this. So next, something that's come up quite a bit in our collections, especially in South Florida, but I'm sure many other institutions as well, is how do you approach collections in languages other than English? Especially if you are not a native or fluent speaker of the language that the material is actually created in. And then also, how do you deal with collections from other geographic locations, other regions that have different cultural considerations? And so the first question really has to do with positionality and how important positionality is in this entire process. And so being honest with yourself and saying, are you equipped to make determinations based on your personal experience and your background? Or is someone else better equipped to help you, to guide you through this process? And so we believe that really the best solution is to invite the input of the communities that are represented in your collection, and that will help you make the best type of determination and not, I believe Keila mentioned this previously, not work in a silo. Another consideration is, what level of granularity are you going to add to these descriptions? We, as archivists, librarians, we have dealt with material in many different formats, and some of these are more simple in the level of complexity. That's a funny statement, but they're less complex than others. And for instance, a photograph may only have a few subject headings. However, if you have a VHS tape of 2 hours of an interview that was recorded, there might be a large number of subjects that are covered. And what level of granularity are you going to really go into when you're describing this content or making changes to the descriptions? So this is probably the type of decision that you want to make at a policy level and not place individuals, place the burden on individuals to make that determination. And policies such as this can include suggestions for including added descriptive language where we know the content may be harmful. So for instance, you may not choose to add every single subject that's covered in this 2-hour interview, but you may want to include that there is potentially harmful language within the subject of the interview. And so that's one way of trying to make a determination, and where maybe like a decision tree might be helpful as well. So now that we've talked about some of the considerations, I'd like to talk about some of the opportunities. There's lots of fantastic opportunities in doing this work. It really provides for individual institutions to connect with the communities that we have represented in our collections. And it also really helps, really the point of the work that we're doing is we want to increase accessibility of the collections for these potentially underserved communities, but really all the communities that are served and represented in the work that we do. And lastly, this work I think is a fantastic opportunity for us to engage with our colleagues and have a continuous dialogue that allows us to examine our own bias and connect with our practice and our scholarship and theory, and really make an impact in contemporary social justice activism. So thank you very much. And I'll hand it back over to Keila.
Thank you, Jamie and Kelly. So here is some additional resources that you might want to consider exploring. The Sunshine State Digital Network has a more extensive 3-part series on conscious editing that provides a more in-depth introduction to these concepts than we did at the beginning, but we did want to touch on introducing them a little bit. We encourage you to explore that series. The recordings are available at sunshinestatedigitalnetwork.org, as well as our YouTube channel. We also developed a inclusive metadata and conscious editing resource list that leads you to existing literature around inclusive description projects, and thinking about this work more holistically and across different aspects of description. So we also encourage you to check out the SAA descriptive section, inclusive description resources that offer guidance around archival description specifically. And then we have some, we've cited the content statements here that we used as examples earlier in our slide deck. I highly recommend the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia Anti-Racist Description resources. It provides a lot of guidance around how to add context and how to select language that is more active rather than passive, and thinking about how we can place our resources in better context. I know at Florida State University, we have a lot of resources related to slavery and plantations. And so thinking about how we can contextualize those materials to be better representative of the people who lived and worked and were enslaved in those spaces, this resource has been very invaluable in thinking about that. So I highly encourage you to check these resources out. This is a starting place, and these are a great place to look and become a little bit more familiar with these concepts. So yeah, again, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time during your FLA conference to watch our presentation. We encourage you to send us questions that you may have, and to check out the additional resources that we have available on the Sunshine State Digital Network website. And if you are exploring those and you have questions, please reach out to us. We want to engage with you in conversation around this and really ensure that librarians around the state are thinking about how we can ensure respectful and broader representation and allow our users to see themselves more in our collections. So thank you again, and thank you to Kelley and Jamie again for your participation and all of the hard work that y'all are doing at FIU. It's really going to help inform more conversations and workflows in other places. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Keila.
And everyone have a great rest of your conference.